flame. We one in the same. But what I need to know is who running this thing.
I go hard in the paint.
Yeah, we love the sport. In the game since day one. We run the court.
Now, you all know we like breaking down the what ifs that nobody else is talking about. But today, we got a good one for you. We already spoke about if MJ didn't take 5 years off, Magic didn't get HIV. We speculated if Steph plays 4 more seasons. What if Larry Bird wasn't a cheapo?
The reason the question is, what if Larry Bird wasn't such a cheapo, is because in 1985, when he was like 28, 29 years old, during the offseason, he went back to French Lick, Indiana, the hick from French Lick, went back home, and instead of just going down to Home Depot or hiring a contractor, he decided his mom needed a new driveway, so he was going to build it himself, started shoveling gravel, and sure enough, hurt his back and set in motion this debilitating back injury that basically plagued and hindered his entire career from that point forward. He was only 28, 29 at that time. He only played maybe 6 more seasons, but just imagine had he been healthy or he had been able to play even more years.
So yeah, that's bugged out. You said he was 28, 29 at the time. I remember him looking so old with holding his back. I don't know if it was sciatica or whatever it is. How did that affect his career? How did it affect his numbers? Because remember, he got busy in the 80s and then started tailing off.
Yeah, so it's crazy because in the final 7 seasons, so once he hurt his back, 29 years old, played 7 more seasons. There was one season where he only played 6 games, but even if you look at the other 6, he only averaged 69 games. You know, shout out Rob Gronkowski. 69 games a year. I mean, it wasn't like he was in that 78 range where most of those players back in the day were.
So he played 12 seasons, 11 if you take out the season he only played 6 games. I'll take that out already. So you're saying the back had him banged up for 7 of those years? That's a big chunk.
Like, I mean, I remember Bird being just nasty, and you hear the trash talk, you hear about him with the greatest shooters and 3-point competitions and all that. But when you look back, I forget just what kind of crazy achievements he had in his career. So we'll talk about that in a few.
That's a bozo move. Why didn't you just pay some dudes to do the job? He had to do it himself. Let's talk numbers. If he would have played to 38 years old, how would he have stacked up, barring that injury?
So we looked at this a couple ways. Again, as always, trying to be somewhat realistic. One is we just added 3 seasons to his career with his career average, or what I'll call a projected average, which factors in some decline over those 3 years. We also looked at what his numbers would have been if he was healthy during his 30s and still played to 38. So that actually gives him more games. It gives him, he doesn't have that season where he only played 6 games. So it gives him more games, gives him till he's 38. But imagine if he was healthy, what could have been,
Give me those, if he would have played those extra 3 seasons, where would he be?
All right, so if we just added 3 seasons on, projected or career average, rebounds, he'd be about 30th all time. He'd either be 29th or 31st all time. Remember, this is a small forward. It's not like he was a power forward center. He's a small forward. Steals, he'd be 16th, 17th all time. That actually puts him right there with Kobe and Isaiah Thomas. And while he wouldn't be in the top 50 in blocks, he'd be number 6 all time for a small forward. So on assists, he'd be between 18th, which would put him just above Tim Hardaway, and 23rd all time. So either 18th or 23rd. And on points, he'd be somewhere between 11th or 19th. And that's just adding the 3 seasons on top of those years where he was averaging, 60, 69 games. So in those 3 seasons, what we did is we said, all right, let's give him 77 games. So much higher than what he had been averaging at that point. But again, you look at that era and 77 was not an unreasonable number.
From 30 to 38. Had he been healthy those years, what are we looking at?
In rebounds, he'd be up to 19th, so top 20 in rebounds. And that would actually put him ahead of Charles Barkley, the round mound of rebound, right? So that would put him ahead of Barkley, would still have him above Patrick Ewing.
Ewing got rebounds, too.
Ewing got boards, yeah. And then when you look at blocks, I won't talk about his defense because I think a lot of people overlook that, but he'd be number 3 for a small forward. In steals, he'd actually be as high as 8th, just behind Scottie Pippen. Assists, he'd be 14th to 16th, which puts him actually right there with Rondo. And in points, he'd either be 6th, which is right behind Jordan and right ahead of Dirk, and 8th, which would actually put him just ahead of Shaq. Pretty impressive numbers if you factor in, health in his 30s.
Bird is obviously considered one of the greatest shooters, but they really didn't shoot threes back then. How about if he was heaving them up like Steph? Where would his numbers be then?
He averaged just under 2 attempts per game, and he shot 38%, call 40%. If we didn't change, didn't add more shots to his shots per game, his field goal attempts, but we did shift that from 2 3-point attempts a game to 9 3-point attempts, which means 7 of his regular field goal attempts were threes instead of twos. And he shot 38%. That gives him an increase in his points per game average each year, because we're averaging this for his career of 2.8 points per game, which over the course of all those games that we've kind of put in with him being healthy equals about 3,500 points on his resume. So big numbers there.
So where does that bump him in the all-time rankings? That's a bump.
Yeah, it's a big bump. That brings him to 4th all-time in scoring.
Wow, 4th? Yo, that seems to be pretty impressive. That sounds about right, because everybody considered him to be one of the greatest scorers of all time. Where do you have him all time? Not with those numbers, but with his actual numbers, and just with the eye test. Where do you have him ranked?
I put him in that 6 to 9 range, right? I don't put him in that top 5. I put him right there with Magic. Those guys are always going to be linked in their careers. Magic did some things better than Bird. Bird did some things better than Magic, but I think I give Bird this slight bump because his defense was actually drastically underrated. And Magic, Magic was not known for his defense. And I mean, you look at Bird, here's what's crazy. He played 12 seasons, 12-time All-Star, went to 5 finals. So, almost 50% of his career he in the finals, won 3 of those, twice got finals MVP. He's 9-time All-NBA first team and second team one year. And people don't actually realize he was a 3-time All-Defensive second team selection as well. So that's the thing I think that gets underrated. We talked about the steals. We talked about the blocks. People forget about that because he was such a great offensive player. But I kind of have him in that 6 to 9 with Magic, with Tim Duncan. That's where I would kind of put him for me. So what about, I don't know. What about you?
He was the real deal. We all know Larry Bird. He was a winner. He was a champion. But as what was bugged out was as his injuries were bothering him and it was nagging him in the back, remember who he was up against. He was up against these buzzsaws, Pistons, the Bulls, and that was on the tail end when he was hurt. So
those Lakers teams, yeah. I mean, I remember some of those battles against the Pacers, where he smashed his face on the court, basically got a concussion and came back and dominated in the 4th quarter with Chuck Person and Pacers. I mean, those were battles.
It was physical, and his injury and it being so physical at the time, that was it. You know what I mean? Maybe if he would have played today, he could have got away with a little bit more. It's a little less physical, but that's just the way it was.
But he still shouldn't have shoveled a fucking driveway.
You get what you pay for. Don't be a cheapo. And when it's time to do it, bring your wallet. Out to my man, Lil Mo Mozzarella. Yo, don't be a cheapo. Larry Bird, one of the greatest ever, though, for sure.